has had its own distinctive set of causes, both specific causes and general causes, and a very different ideological formulation about how to respond. The thing that they all share, and why I use the term global jihad, is they all see the problems that they're dealing with as an international systemic problem. So these are not local jihad groups out to overthrow a local regime, for example, which is the typical armed jihadi groups, but have very much a global agenda that addresses global problems. So 4 specific waves of that, which we'll talk about. And then in the last 10 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is to ask the question, so where does this global jihad movement that I've spent a number of pages examining, where does it fit in the universe of violent socio-political movements? How do we understand it by comparison to other violent socio-political movements that we've seen over the last century? And I will make an argument about a novel, what I am referring to as a novel form of political violence, a movement of rage that can be usefully compared to other movements of rage that are both religious and non-religious, but all are marked by these twin characteristics of nihilistic violence, nihilism in a political sense, not philosophical sense, and apocalyptic, that is end times millenarian ideologies. All right, so those are the 2 arguments, and so let's just get right in to it. Now, in the book itself, global jihad does not just drop out of the sky, manna from heaven or something. It has a history, it has roots to it. So I go over the creation of Islamism or political Islam, which is very much a 20th century movement linked to essentially 20th century problems. Mostly a non-violent, and when we talk about Islamism, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, mostly non-violent, not entirely. But the point I wanted to make here is that violence is not central to its program, to the program of Islamism. In the 60s and 70s, we see the rise of the intellectual architecture of modern jihadism, for whom violence is central to the program. And that is really the difference between Islamists and jihadis. Is the issue of violence. For jihadis, all other avenues to change, to move towards some version of an Islamic state, for example, has been blocked. And so violence becomes the key tool to move forward. In the 1980s, you saw this variant of jihadism take root, and again, I'll go over the history here in the next few minutes, that is globally oriented and not locally oriented. And as I said, each has a very distinctive set of characteristics. So let's get into that. We'll begin with that, the first wave, which is very much linked to the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, an invasion in December of 1979 and occupation throughout most of the 1980s. So that is the specific crisis that actually launches what emerges as the first wave of global jihad, is that Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. But beyond that, the more general, again, systemic global issue, according to particularly this man that you see in the slide in the upper right, Imam al-Jihad, the preacher of jihad, Abdullah Yusuf Azam, who's a Palestinian Jordanian that was really the greatest popularizer of the Afghan jihad in Arab and Muslim circles. Traveled around the world raising money and awareness of the Afghan jihad, including coming to this country to raise money and awareness of the Afghan jihad itself. But he looked around and said, look, Afghanistan is not unique. There are a dozen places or so around the world where Muslim communities are essentially occupied and ruled by non-Muslim powers, infidel powers, in areas that were historically Muslim, historically under Muslim rule. So the Afghan problem of foreign invasion, occupation, and infidel rule in Afghanistan is mimicked in a dozen other places around the world. Next would be Palestine. He was very clear about that under Israeli occupation, but also the Central Asian republics, the 5 Central Asian republics that were then under Moscow rule, Kashmir in northern India, Mindanao in southern Spain, and a handful of other places that were historically Muslim lands that are being ruled by these infidel powers. So once we're done with Afghanistan, we need to, the sort of the marching orders of the jihad movement should be the liberation of further Muslim territory. So this focus on territoriality. So let's talk a little bit about the specific kind of ideological formulation to liberate these foreign or liberate these Muslim territories from foreign occupation. And in the book, I highlight really 4 innovations that Abdullah Azzam makes in his writings and speeches. Again, the man was quite prolific in his writings. The first is, and this is common amongst all jihadis, is to, as you're probably all aware, there are 5 pillars of Islam. Jihad is not one of them. And we're talking jihad here, I'm talking jihad as-sayf, jihad of the sword, armed jihad, not jihad an-nafs, personal jihad. Most all jihadis, local and global, say armed jihad should be, in fact, the second pillar of Islam, that only after faith, iman, only that is more important than armed jihad. But the purpose of armed jihad will vary from jihadi ideologue to jihadi ideologue. You see here in the way that Azzam formulated it, it's armed jihad in defense of Muslim lands is the most important obligation after faith itself. The most important or interesting ideological formulation that, again, sort of launches this notion of global jihad is his concept, what I call, not as translation, but as trying to sort of get the nub of what's going on, the jihadi international. And the Arabic phrase is al-Qa'ida al-Sulba, al-Qa'ida al-Sulba, which is usually translated as the solid base or the solid foundation. This was a common phrase amongst jihadis in Afghanistan and Pakistan and elsewhere in the 1980s. What they meant by that was territory. And frankly, what they really meant by that was Afghanistan. That once they had captured Afghanistan, that was the solid base or the solid foundation, creating an Islamic state there, and then moving out from Afghanistan in various ways once that solid foundation was created. In the last 2 years of Azzam's life, he was assassinated in 1989, a few months after the Soviets left Afghanistan. He started to reinterpret al-Qa'ida Sulba, the solid base, not as territory, but the solid base being a warrior class of pious Muslims that would work with local populations around the world, local Muslim populations, to help them liberate their occupied territory from non-Muslim rule. So it went from a territorial conception to a conception of a pious warrior class that, again, would travel around the world and work with Muslim communities. This was a radical reinterpretation of the concept. I call it the Jihadi International because it's essentially the same concept of the Communist International that was created after the Soviet Union was formed in 1917. And the Communist International was essentially a warrior class that would travel around Europe and beyond to assist local populations to liberate themselves from bourgeois exploitation and domination. So it's the same concept, but instead of bourgeois exploitation and domination, it was foreign occupation, non-Muslim occupation of Muslim societies. That was the target of this Jihadi International. So that I go into in some detail in the book because I find it the most interesting concept that Azzam, because he was assassinated, he didn't have a lot of time to really flesh out the concept. An article that he wrote in this magazine that you see in the upper right-hand corner was his fullest expression of this consideration of al-Qa'ida Sulba away from territory and towards this warrior class that he talks about. He makes two other, just very briefly, two other, I think, interesting ideological innovations within the jihadi community. One is to give a good sort of philosophical underpinning as to why one should understand armed jihad as a permanent revolution. This has been around only since Said Qutb in the 1960s, who was hanged by the Nasser regime in Egypt in 1966, essentially for calling for the armed overthrow of the Egyptian regime. Qutb talked about jihad being permanent, da'ima, but he never gave a really good reason why we should have this, again, pretty radical reinterpretation of jihad from an episodic event, something that happened once in a while, had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then it was over for a while, to a permanent feature of the landscape, almost a state of nature kind of conceptualization. Azam gave that philosophical underpinnings, and I don't have time to go into details, but he linked it with the idea of tawhid, which is usually translated as monotheism, but for Salafi jihadi types, it means a lot more than that. The tawhid gets to the, in the sort of Old Testament biblical sense, the awesomeness of God, that God is omnipotent and omnipresent. He is everywhere and everything. Again, that sort of awe-inspiring nature of God. And the way that a Muslim can fully experience that awesomeness of God, that tawhid, is through participation in an armed jihad. So again, there's more to it than that, but essentially that was his argument underlying this notion why armed jihad must be seen as a permanent revolution and not an episodic event. And finally, with Azam, more than anybody else, he created the cult of martyrdom in jihadi circles. In the 70s and really into the 1980s, this stressing of the need to die, the desire to die in pursuit of an armed jihad, of a legitimate armed jihad, which has become very common in jihadi circles today. It wasn't at all there, really at all in the 70s and most of the 80s. I'll introduce a book in just a moment by a major jihadi ideologue that has no kind of cult of martyrdom aspect to it at all. And that was the sort of the theme back in the 70s and 80s. Azam, because he was a trained cleric from Al-Azhar in Cairo, so he had a legitimate doctoral degree in theology, Islamic theology, he was able to essentially create this intellectual architecture upon which this cult of martyrdom rests today. And again, the desire, the embracing of being killed in pursuit of a jihad. All right, so the first wave essentially ends when Azam is assassinated in 1989 by unknown suspects. And in 1990, his idea, this jihadi international idea, was brought to the Saudi royal family after the Iraq invasion of Kuwait in 1990, August of 1990. And the Saudis rejected this notion that bin Laden said, let me do the Jihadi International. I will put together 100,000 warriors. We will liberate Kuwait that way. The Saudis declined the offer, brought in the Americans instead. And that essentially both ended the first wave, for the most part, of global jihad and was a major stepping stone in the radicalization of this man, Osama bin Laden. The second wave begins not right away, but in the mid-1990s, and goes, I take it to 2011 when bin Laden was assassinated by Navy SEALs, but essentially by 2003 or so, Al-Qaeda Central, as people would call it, was essentially destroyed. It was just a hollow shell of what it had been before. Once again, you have a specific and general crisis. They're quite different from the occupation of Afghanistan or the occupation of Muslim lands. Here for bin Laden, the second wave is born of the defeat of local jihadi groups, particularly in Egypt and Algeria, two major Arab countries that in the early 90s looked like jihadi or Islamist elements would take over power. And by the mid 90s, they had, pretty clearly at that point been defeated. And these quote unquote apostate regimes were going to remain in place. At the same time, you had throughout the 1990s, following the Iraq War of 1991, you had a growing US military footprint on the Arabian Peninsula, permanent kind of military bases, which had not existed 10 years earlier in the 1980s, but in the 1990s were growing rather large, frankly. And bin Laden linked these two developments together, the defeat of jihadi groups with the ever-increasing military presence of the Americans. That led to the general crisis that he was interested in, and that is the durability of apostate, again, what he would view as apostate regimes in Riyadh, in Cairo, in Algiers, elsewhere, that these regimes that should be overthrown are rather, sort of unexpectedly durable. How do we understand that? And this is what bin Laden's second wave project was all about, was to drive out the Americans from Arabia and beyond in order to make these local apostate regimes more vulnerable. So again, a couple of documents in particular I focus on in the book, 1996 Declaration of War and a 1998 fatwa. He did not have the religious credentials to issue a fatwa. But here it gets announced. For example, those of you that can read Arabic, Al-Quds Al-Arabi, the local, actually London-based newspaper, that says bin Laden and Zawahiri, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who may have died fairly recently. Rafat Taha was another jihadi from Egypt, opine, or issue a fatwa, if you will, to kill Americans fi kul makan, in any location. So this was a sort of a clarion call for mass murder. All right, so let's do the same thing with bin Laden that we did with Azzam, and sort of what were the ideological innovations in the second wave of global jihad, which again was not focused on liberating territory. It was focused on driving the Americans out in order to weaken local apostate regimes. Three things I focus on in the book. One is that first bullet point should look familiar to you from the Azzam first bullet point, which is again, after faith, after Iman, what is the most important duty for all Muslims? For bin Laden, it was the most important duty after that was pushing the American enemy out of the Holy Land, as he uses that term. Probably the most interesting thing that he does is to flip the near enemy, far enemy dichotomy. Some of you may are familiar with that phrasing. Well, that dichotomy, near enemy, far enemy, was invented by this man who you see on the screen behind armed bars, Muhammad Abdus-Salam Faraj, who's also the author of this book here. I'll get to in a moment. Faraj was one of the principal actors in the assassination of Anwar Sadat in Egypt in 1981, which is why you see him behind bars here, and he was executed for that activity. He wrote, a couple of years before then, he wrote a manuscript for his fellow jihadis. It was not particularly long, entitled Al-Farid al-Ghaiba. Here you see it, Al-Farid al-Ghaiba, the missing or the hidden or the absent obligation or duty. It gets translated in different ways. And he tells his fellow jihadis in this book, don't worry about the far enemy, which he defines as Israel. We need to focus our attention on the near enemy, that is the local apostate regimes, in this case, the Sadat regime in Cairo. And he gives the reasons why, but basically this was warning his fellow jihadis, don't spend all your time worrying about Israel. Let's focus our attention on the apostate regime that is ruling over Egypt. Bin Laden turns that on its head. It flips it 180 degrees and says, no, in fact, that has it backwards. Faraj had it backwards. We don't have a chance of overthrowing the near enemy regimes, these apostate regimes, until we drive the far enemy out of the region. And the far enemy now for bin Laden was not Israel, but was the United States. Israel was essentially sort of an appendage of the United States in bin Laden's thinking. So in terms of an ideological innovation, this near enemy, far enemy reversal was probably the most important conception that bin Laden made. And the third here that I've already mentioned, that making it obligatory Farz Ain on his followers, anybody that wanted to follow him, to engage in mass murder against Americans, military and civilian, no difference between the two. So when we talk about apocalyptic, of nihilistic violence, this is an example of a call for nihilistic violence. All right, let's move on for the sake of time. The third wave, the ISIS wave, the caliphate, if you will, 2003 with the US invasion of Iraq to ended at 2017 with the destruction of the territorial caliphate, the territorial state. ISIS is still with us. They're the biggest, most dangerous jihadi group in the world today, but they're no longer a state. They no longer rule a territory, which is why I draw a close to its wave. Again, specific crisis or crises, the destruction of the Iraqi state in 2003 with the American invasion. And then in 2011, the Syrian civil war, in both cases lead to what was seen as rule by the infidel Shia. It creates, incidentally, in the 2003 to 2005, in this 2 to 3 year time period, led to some of the most, sort of fervent, active debates and contributions and publications, contestations within the jihadi community. Some of the most important jihadi documents ever written were written just in those first 2 to 3 years after the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. The ISIS wave is by far the biggest of the 4 waves that I'm talking about. So there are a lot of ideologues, there are a lot of key documents. So again, for the sake of time, let me just focus on some of the most important ideological innovations in this third wave of global jihad. Again, this is a very different goal. It's not about liberating territory. It's not about driving the Americans out of Arabia to weaken apostate regimes. This was a state building enterprise. This was building what I refer to as a pre-Westphalian state. So not a sort of typical 20th, 21st century state, but something that was sort of the old-fashioned states before they agreed on the rules of the game. And that state's primary focus was not about apostate regimes or, again, liberating territory. Its primary focus was to create a Sharia-based state that would banish apostasy itself, sinful behavior, to make it difficult, if not impossible, for sin to take place within the confines of this caliphate. This is, to be provocative, I do relate it a little bit to the Augustine dichotomy of city of God, city of man, and sort of the primary duty of city of man. There's an element to this. I don't want to take it too far in ISIS thinking about creating an Islamic state or creating a state where the temporal authorities make it possible for a Muslim to live a fully pious religious life within the confines of a city of God, if you will. So lots of interesting different things that ISIS does. The declaration of the caliphate itself, obviously, nobody else had done that before ISIS did it, since it had been banished by Turkish Republicans in the 1920s. Couple of other things I'll point out. One is the issue of violence. And this book in the upper right-hand corner, Idarat al-Tawahush, the management or administration of savagery, has been translated by Will McCants into English, so you can find it online if you'd like to read it. It gets to, and this is also written, incidentally, in the same 2003 to 2005 timeframe. It gets to the role of savage, performative, gory violence, both in terms of liberating territory and in terms of ruling before institutions can be built, ruling over a population. The point here is that really sort of gory, performative violence that we all associate with ISIS. I have a screenshot of the one of these acts against a Jordanian pilot, for example. This was not a coincidence. This was not something they made up as they went along. This was something that was laid out, sort of the importance of doing in this book of Idrat al-Tawahush a decade earlier. The apocalyptic ideology, McCants has gone into that in some detail. ISIS is really the most important jihadi group to really focus part of its ideology on an end times, a millenarian aspect to what they stood for, extreme sectarianism as well. But also, last point, and then I'll move on, is what I call jihadi cool. Which is essentially an updated version of what 19th century Russian anarchists would refer to as propaganda of the deed. The sort of just do it, just go out and do what it is that you want to do and let that be your propaganda. So there was this kind of coolness factor that ISIS really didn't make much of an effort to convince leading clerics around the world in the rightness of its cause. What it was more interested in doing was attracting young men looking for meaning and excitement in their lives to come fight for them. And you could do all kinds of really cool stuff. And we can talk about that if you'd like, what constitutes that cool stuff. But that was, again, a very important feature for ISIS that I think all future jihadi groups will learn from as a result. All right, let's move on then to the current fourth wave of global jihad, what I refer to as the Jihad Fardi, which is a term that you see that was created by this man that you see on your screen, Abu Musab al-Suri. See him on the bottom with bin Laden himself. Different crisis, different ideological goal. The specific crisis for him was the destruction of the so-called Emirate of Afghanistan under Taliban rule at the end of 2001. Others in this wave would see a similar or parallel event with the destruction of the territorial caliphate in 2017. For Abu Musab al-Suri, the broader problem when he was writing in 2003, 2004, was the looming defeat of the global jihad movement itself. He was writing from a position of weakness, of fear that they were being destroyed, effectively destroyed by the Americans and their allies in the aftermath of the 2001 terror attacks, the 9/11 terror attacks. So he wrote this 1,600-page, huge internet book. You see a picture of it here on your screen, Da'wat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya al-Alamiyya, the Global Islamic Resistance Call. Again, comes out 2004, 2005. And in it, he tries to create a system, not a new organization, a system that can survive the sort of terrible onslaught against the global jihad community. So that's what he was trying to do. That was his strategy. Nizam la tanzim, Nizam la tanzim, system, not organization. Organizations are too easy to get rolled up by security forces or outside powers. So you need to have a system that takes full use of 21st century internet and social media technologies to create a system of personal, what has come into English as leaderless jihad, again, personal jihad, jihad fardi, of individuals inspired by global jihad, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda or anybody else, inspired by global jihad, but who autonomously undertake violence, what we call stochastic violence or stochastic terror. It's a hallmark of global jihad, the fourth wave of global jihad, as incidentally, it's a hallmark of elements of the white nationalist movement. A wiki narrative, instead of having one or two or three prominent ideologues, all of whom could be assassinated, have a communal attempt to keep a narrative going of global jihad, to stitch in new acts of violence, stochastic violence typically, into this broader narrative that lives in the digital realm. And again, an emphasis on really over-the-top violence directed at civilians. All right. So how does global jihad kind of fit into the broader universe of violent violent movements over the last century or so. And here in the last chapter of the book, I try and make an argument that most violent political movements of the last century are based on some element of Enlightenment ideals, science, liberty, justice, progress. Even whether they're Leninist or nationalist, as the two figures in the middle are, or there's Mussolini at the bottom. Even fascism is based on the idea of forward progress, on development, right? Mussolini's famous line of making the trains run on time, captures that nicely. But whether it's of the left, Leninists, of sort of national liberation movements, or fascism itself, they're all based on elements of Enlightenment ideals. But there's a fairly small but important category of violent actors that are not based on those Enlightenment ideals. And this is what I call, following Ken Jowett, a distinctive form of violence, a movement of rage that is anti-Enlightenment. So it really has, and I try and draw this out in the book, two defining characteristics: nihilistic violence in its political sense, that is extensive root and branch system destroying violence, not meaningless violence, which would be the philosophical sense, and apocalyptic anti-Enlightenment ideology. And as part of that apocalyptic ideology, one feature that you see across the board is this cultural contamination. I refer to this, I make up this, this word of gnocicide, from a combination of Greek and Latin, meaning the killing of knowledge. And that could be actually the direct elimination of those with knowledge. So there are a number of movements of rage that we see over the last century. I list some here. The exemplar is the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, for example. The depopulated Phnom Penh essentially killed off anybody that was educated. People that wore ties, spoke foreign language, Western languages, were essentially the first people to be eliminated. The Red Guards in China had, I think, strong elements of movement of rage. Boko Haram, books, education is forbidden. In Nigeria, before they got onto the global jihad bandwagon, was a localized movement of rage. The brown shirts in Germany, before they were essentially discarded by the Nazis in 1934, but they were a serious movement of rage in the 20s and early 30s in Germany. And I would say elements of the white nationalist movement today constitute a movement of rage as well. So just finally here, then, I make the argument that global jihad is a movement of rage, kind of a variant form of a movement of rage. It shares the nihilistic violence, it shares the apocalyptic ideology, which includes cultural contamination, but it's at the global level. It's not a local, national movement. If you look at, again, all the ones I've mentioned, these are all local, national groups. They were not globally focused. Global jihad, as the name would indicate, is globally focused. So it's a variant movement of rage based on the global system. And with that, I will end. And I will end my sharing of screen and turn it back over to Professor Hashemi.
Great, thanks, Glenn, for that overview. Just watching you give your presentation and reading sections of your book, it's really a perfect teaching tool for students interested in the history and the evolution of global jihad. I guess one question that I'd like to pose before I open it up to other people who are watching, and if anyone has a question, you can post it in the chat. But could you give us a sense, as someone who's studied the history, the evolution, and the transformation of this phenomenon, what comes next after ISIS? Are you suggesting that this sort of politics of mass rage is really what we can expect in the Middle East, or are you expecting some reiteration or revitalization of ISIS or Al Qaeda? If you were to sort of cast your gaze on the state of politics in the Middle East and look at sort of what happens in the next 5 to 10 years with respect to these militant movements, what do you predict will emerge? Will it be Al Qaeda? Will it be ISIS? Will it be something different? Could you share us your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, great questions. And I guess I would have two responses. First, while I was writing this book, sometimes I felt a little bit like Norman Cohn writing in The Pursuit of the Millennium, where we do have to understand that, the thing that I'm studying is a pretty marginal phenomenon, and it's kind of the larger currents of the Middle East that are in the Muslim world that are going around. The thing that I'm looking at is a pretty marginal event. I think it's important. I think it's interesting. I enjoyed reading Mr. Cohn back in graduate school. So I hope it's a useful contribution, but I don't want to imply that, this is kind of all the rage and taking over the Middle East. I think there are more important dynamics at play to understand broader Middle East politics. And the second thing I would say in terms of global jihad, I think this fourth wave is going to be with us. I think it's a durable wave. It's not a huge strategic threat, but it will kill people from time to time, as we have seen. Most of the attacks, since the rise of ISIS in 2014, 2015, virtually all of the jihadi attacks in North America have been this form of stochastic violence, inspired violence. So, you look at the Pulse nightclub bomber, Omar Mateen, in Florida. There's no evidence that he was in communication or had logistical support from ISIS, although he claimed the attack in their name. So it was an inspired act of violence. The San Bernardino shooters, also no evidence that they were in cahoots with ISIS or anybody else, but they were inspired to do what they did. Same thing with in New York, where a fellow from Central Asia killed a number of bicyclists by ramming his truck into them. Again, no evidence that he was working with any group. So these are all stochastic acts of terror in this case. And that I think that is a pretty durable form of violence. So I would expect, you still have jihadi groups. ISIS is still a fairly potent jihadi group. Even in Afghanistan, it is spread. So as a kind of more old-fashioned jihadi group, you'll still see that. They're still around. They're probably not going anywhere in the near term. But in terms of particularly violence in the West and in North America and elsewhere, I think this fourth wave of stochastic violence is going to be with us actually for quite a long time.
Okay, great. Now, I have to take advantage of this opportunity to ask you a question about Palestine, since you're a scholar of Palestinian politics. If you read Bin Laden, the question of Palestine, the plight of the Palestinians, is a frequent reference for his anger, for his rage at the United States. When it comes to ISIS, that is much harder to detect. Now, I'm wondering how you see this cause of Palestine playing itself out within these jihadi movements. It seems to have diminished. It seems to not be a focus. There's other sort of issues here. Could you share your thoughts on how you would sort of evaluate the political ideology of radical jihadism with respect to the question of Palestine?
Yeah, I think you've got it exactly right, and that is it used to be more important than it is today. And so we can see that in the evolution of bin Laden. He writes this people have made the mistake of overemphasizing Palestine in bin Laden's thought, and people have made the mistake of underestimating Palestine in his thought. Palestine was always an important issue for him. It wasn't the top issue for him. The occupation of Arabia was always his biggest issue, beginning in 1990 at least. So he writes his 1996 Declaration of War. Palestine is one of a number of issues that he goes on. This is a fairly long document, and it's kind of meandering, frankly. Did not get much attention. Palestine is there. There's no question. It's an important feature for bin Laden. Again, not the most important feature, but one of the most important features. By 1998, it is the top of the list, right? When he issues this fatwa, the occupation of Arabia, Palestine, and Iraq. These are the three biggies because Muslims around the world get it. When you talk about any one of those three issues, everybody knows what you're talking about. So in terms of a marketing and recruiting, not to say that it wasn't really important ideologically, it was, but in terms of marketing and recruiting, that is a much more powerful statement for bin Laden to make than talking sort of inside baseball in jihadi circles in Saudi Arabia, which is the 96 document did a lot of. So back in the 90s, you could see Palestine as a major recruiting tool and ideological tool. And again, well-intentioned, well-meant, but a major tool amongst jihadis because it plays. It is an issue that has symbolic and emotional importance in the Arab and Muslim worlds. But today, when you look at ISIS and the way they talked or other offshoots today, some of these franchises in different places in the world, it's not, Palestine is still an issue. It hasn't gone away, right, but it's not nearly as important as it used to be in terms of recruiting and mobilizing and convincing Muslims about the rightness of their cause.
Mm-hmm. Great. I want to get to the questions that have been posted, but one final question. You do a good job at the beginning of the book talking about Shia political Islam and its connection to jihad and Khomeini, and sort of saying it's basically part of the same set of grievances that produce these types of interpretations of religion, responding to similar social conditions, etc. One of the in my view, one of the biggest movements for jihad in recent times that have killed thousands of people. And I'm not sure if you talk about this in the book or not, because I haven't read sufficiently through it, so you tell me. But one of the biggest movements for jihad is particularly a Shia movement of pan-jihad, organized, financed and supported by the Islamic Republic of Iran to defend Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And I'm referring specifically to the attempt by Iran to recruit using Shia themes of grievance and martyrdom, and to mobilize and finance and send, thousands of young Shia men from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, largely into Syria. And if you actually look at the numbers, in many ways, the numbers might be as big as the ISIS numbers or participants and militants. Do you talk about in that book, and would you consider this also part of, the phenomenon of global jihad, or would you categorize it as something different?
I characterize it as something different. So two-step dance here. The first step is that in the 60s and 70s, as the intellectual architecture for armed jihad for political purposes gets constructed, it's interesting. It's getting constructed in both the Sunni and the Shia worlds. It's getting constructed at the same time. While the language is different, given different theological traditions and stories in Sunni Islam versus Shia Islam. So in Sunni Islam, you don't have talk about Imam al-Ghaib and the 12th Imam and all that. So they use a different language, but they're really getting at very similar things. Issues of social justice, of turning, regimes turning their backs on Islam, of similar kinds of problem set are being developed in this intellectual architecture. Whether Khomeini or Ali Shariati, same thing, Ayatollah Talakani, pretty similar, and Musa Sadr in Lebanon. There's this kind of mobilization and openness to armed jihad in the Shia world, as there was by Said Qutb and others in the Sunni world. So that I do point out, I talk about early in the book of this similarity in the creating the intellectual architecture for jihad, not global jihad, but for jihad. Global jihad is, in my mind, overwhelmingly a Sunni Muslim phenomenon today. Right. Not because there's anything inherent in Sunni Islam as opposed to Shia Islam. It's just kind of the way it happened right now. These are all non-state actors. They may get an assistance from time to time from states. We've seen that as well, including with ISIS. Shia, it seems to me that Shia radicalism, jihadi radicalism, has been fundamentally captured by the Iranian state. since 1979. So there it's not sort of a global, again, sort of actors acting in the international arena. It is a state that is utilizing one tool of statecraft. And I'm not saying they don't believe in it. I think they very much do, but or at least elements do. But it's captured by the state for its own purposes, which strikes me as something considerably different from what you're seeing in the global jihad groups that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. No, great answer. Very good. So we have a question here, at least one good substantive question here that I'd like to pose. The question is as follows. Salafi and jihadi are problematic words for talking about extremism in Islam. As you recognize, the majority of Muslims don't understand jihad as armed struggle or linked to violence. And you mentioned, jihad and nafs, the struggle against temptation. Also, Salafism is a huge and diverse movement. Why then continue using this concept and not instead trying to change the way we refer to this group or these groups or trends for a better understanding?
I would like to attach myself 100% to the question, because I think it's exactly right. So let me talk about that. Using the word jihad or jihadis is problematic because, for practicing Muslims, the term jihad is an honored term. It is something that is, has positive connotations. The people I'm writing about are generally not viewed in positive terms, and you don't want to have a broad brush saying, these folks represent Islam, for example. So why did I choose to use the term jihadi? Because it's the coin of the realm. This is I played with the notion of, should I refer to these as takfiris, which a number of regimes and others use that term. But the book is written for a broader audience. I'd like it to be adopted in your classes at Denver University and elsewhere. And using an obscure term like takfiri would, those who practice takfir would not be, that wouldn't make a lot of sense. So I decided I would use, I talk about it at the very beginning of the book. I talk about the term jihad and what it means and et cetera. But I felt it just for clarity's sake, using the term that is the coin of the realm made the most sense. Same thing with Salafi jihadis, absolutely great. Using Salafi as a synonym for radicalism is totally ahistorical, and I try not to, by the way, and I talk about this in the book, that traditionally Salafis are apolitical, which is why almost all preachers on Arabic religious shows are Salafi preachers, because they have a deference to authority kind of built into their theology. But again, the term Salafi jihadi is, at least among specialists, is a very common term. So I try not to dwell on that a lot, but I do use that term a little bit. But again, I try to define it and put it in context. But the questioner is absolutely right that these are both problematic terms for the reasons I just laid out.
Okay, so we're getting near the end of the program here. If anyone else has a question, please post it. I'm happy to pose questions to Glenn, because there's a lot that has stimulated my own thinking. So when you did the cross comparison, you sort of tried to look at this particular phenomenon on a global stage. You mentioned sort of elements of white nationalism sort of have parallels. A Trump supporter watching this presentation will say, "Come on, Glenn, that's a reach that's just too far. That's unacceptable. Which white nationalist group has done anything close to what ISIS has done in terms of their violence and barbarity?" So how would you respond?
So I say elements of the white nationalist movement. So if you look at, for example, as I do in the book, both the Christchurch, New Zealand, the Noor Mosque massacre in 2019, the Oslo massacre a few years before then, both of those shooters were white nationalists. They both got into the sort of the great replacement theory of, looking at essentially people of color coming into white Christian lands and wanting to drive them out. They both left behind manifestos, so we can sort of see what what they were talking about. There are, and again, in the book, I get into this, there are comparisons to be made in terms of this ideological worldview. And then most importantly is the action itself, right? In both cases, both New Zealand and in Oslo and elsewhere, not just those two places, but you go to El Paso, Texas, for example, if you want. These were people that were inspired by an ideology. Very clearly, they're not just common criminals. They're inspired by white nationalist ideology, but we have no evidence of any logistical support or assistance from any outside group. This was autonomous violence undertaken. And so in other words, the white nationalists, actually, if you go back, the white nationalists created this idea of stochastic violence. It was created by a couple of KKK folks in the 1990s, one of whom recently died in San Diego. So they understood the power of modern information technologies. This was a way to get out the word, to inspire people to take action, but without having to have any logistical connection. So both the ideology itself from some people, and again, the adoption of extreme violence, and the stochastic nature of the violence shares a lot in common with this fourth wave of global jihad.
Yeah, no, that's a very good answer. I mean, because if you read the manifestos that these, attackers in New Zealand and Oslo sort of left behind, they draw upon a lot of themes that is very much part of the white nationalist / Trump sort of worldview. The attack on immigration, multiculturalism, sort of, all of those themes are very much there, although they take it to a violent.
The New Zealand shooter actually mentioned Mr. Trump as I'm just a factual statement. I'm not trying to be partisan. Mentioned Mr. Trump as an inspiration. He thought he was a bit of an oddball, but still on the right path as one of his sources of inspiration.
Okay, so one final question here that has to do with this broad theme of global jihad, and so the questioner asks a question about Ibn Taymiyya as an intellectual source or motivation for this particular phenomenon and these particular groups. And then the question is posed, however, sometimes, Ibn Taymiyya is identified, even though, let me see, I'm trying to read this question, even though they don't regard his ideas as, I guess, authentic. Let me see. However, sometimes I identified that they don't even know the ideas of this author. Oh yeah, I guess the question is, so people, invoke Ibn Taymiyya as a justification for their radicalism in their politics, but they're not sufficiently aware of the, I guess, diversity of Ibn Taymiyya's sort of thought and teachings. So do you have any thoughts on sort of, I guess the question is the selective use of Ibn Taymiyya for political uses in the contemporary period?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I do write fairly extensively on Ibn Taymiyya in the book. Of course, Ibn Taymiyya was a major theologian based primarily in Damascus, 14th century time period. If jihadis sort of ever come to rule in a country, the first thing they would do is raise a statue to Ibn Taymiyya. He is the major intellectual source, and why? Because Ibn Taymiyya wrote actually two religious opinions, fatwas, that said the new rulers in Baghdad, the Mongols in Baghdad, say they're Muslim, but because they're not implementing the Sharia, they're implementing a tribal code that was picked up in Asia. They are not true Muslims, and so it is incumbent upon Muslims to go into active rebellion against them. So modern jihadis use that, use Ibn Taymiyya to justify going into active rebellion against rulers, that this has a historical justification. Now, scholars of Ibn Taymiyya have regularly argued that jihadis can just essentially misuse Ibn Taymiyya quite a bit, including one of the very last things Ibn Taymiyya ever wrote, basically saying, we don't know what's in the hearts of other men. As long as a Muslim is praying, he's a Muslim, and don't question him. So even Ibn Taymiyya sort of discounted his at least one interpretation of his earlier writing. So there is, I think, a pretty strong consensus amongst scholars of Islamic theological history that modern jihadis often misuse Ibn Taymiyyah's work.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Glenn. This has been wonderful. Congrats on the book again. I think it's a major contribution. It really helps us sort of think about this historically and comparatively. And I really love the last chapter where you situate this phenomenon on a global stage and compare it with other sort of violent movements in parts of the non-Muslim world. So I'm sorry we couldn't host you in person, but hopefully next time, if there's an opportunity, we'll certainly reach out.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much, Nader.